The stagecoach rattled to a halt, sending a cloud of dust swirling into the hot Arizona air as Grace Daniels clutched her valise tightly against her chest. After 3 weeks of grueling travel from Boston, she had finally arrived in Copper Creek, a town that would become her home as Mrs. Thomas Blackburn, a man she had never met, but had agreed to marry through a series of hopeful letters exchanged over 6 months. The year was 1878, and at 22, Grace had made the difficult decision to leave behind her life as a seamstress in Boston. The crowded tenements and limited opportunities had worn her down, and Thomas's letters filled with promises of a comfortable home on a small ranch and a good, steady life had been her salvation. Copper Creek. The driver called out, his voice gruff from years of shouting above the rumble of coach wheels. End of the line for today. Grace smoothed her travel-worn blue dress and adjusted her bonnet before accepting the driver's hand to help her down. The small frontier town stretched before her, a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store with a wide porch, a saloon, and what appeared to be a small church at the far end. "Thank you," she said to the driver as her boots touched the hard, packed dirt. "Could you direct me to the Blackburn Ranch? I am expected." The driver's weathered face fell slightly. "Miss, I think you ought to speak with Sheriff Miller first. His office is just down the way." He pointed to a building with a wooden star hanging above the door. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked, her heart suddenly pounding. The driver shifted uncomfortably. Best you talk to the sheriff, miss." With growing unease, Grace made her way to the sheriff's office. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel perspiration beading along her hairline beneath her bonnet. As she approached the sheriff's office, a tall man stepped out, squinting against the sunlight. Sheriff Miller was a middle-aged man with a gray-streaked mustache and kind eyes that now regarded her with something like pity. "Afternoon, madam. Can I help you? I'm Grace Daniels. I've come to marry Thomas Blackburn. The stagecoach driver suggested I speak with you first." The sheriff removed his hat. "Miss Daniels, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Perhaps you'd like to step inside." The small office was sparse but mercifully cool after the heat outside. Grace sat rigidly in the offered chair, her valise still clutched against her. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but Thomas Blackburn passed away 3 days ago. Fever took him quick-like. We sent a telegram to Boston, but you must have already been on your way." The world seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. "Dead," she whispered. "But I just received a letter from him 2 weeks ago before I departed. He was making preparations for our wedding." "I'm truly sorry, Miss Daniels. Tom was a good man. He spoke often about his bride to be coming from back east." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Have you any family you can return to?" Grace shook her head numbly. "No, I have no family. I sold everything to come here." The enormity of her situation crashed down upon her. She had less than $15 to her name, no prospects, and nowhere to go. "There's a boarding house run by Widow Jenkins. I can escort you there for tonight, and perhaps tomorrow we can figure something out." Sheriff Miller's voice was gentle but practical. "What of Mr. Blackburn's property, his ranch?" Grace asked, suddenly remembering the small homestead Thomas had described in his letters. "It's about 5 miles outside of town. Not much to it, I'm afraid. Tom was just getting started. The bank will likely claim it for debts unless—" A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Miller rose and opened it, revealing a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and dust covered his boots and the lower part of his denims. "Jake," the sheriff acknowledged, "just finished." The man nodded, his expression solemn beneath the brim of his hat. "It's done, Sheriff. Gave him a proper burial on that ridge he always liked, overlooking his land." "Miss Daniels," Sheriff Miller said, turning back to Grace, "this is Jake Foster. He worked with Thomas occasionally and has been kind enough to see to the burial." Grace rose on unsteady legs, meeting the stranger's gaze. His eyes were a startling blue against his tanned face, and they widened slightly as they took her in. "You're Tom's bride," he stated simply, not a question but a realization. "I was to be," Grace replied, her voice barely audible. Jake removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with hints of gold from the sun. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. "I'm mighty sorry about your loss, Miss Daniels. Tom spoke very highly of you." Something in his direct gaze and the gentleness of his rough voice broke through Grace's shock. Tears welled in her eyes, not just for the man she had never met, but for her own desperate circumstances. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, surprising herself with the raw honesty. "I've spent everything I had to come here." Jake exchanged a look with the sheriff before turning back to Grace. "Tom's place. It ain't much, but it's better than nothing. You could stay there while you figure things out. It rightfully should have been yours anyway." "The bank," Sheriff Miller began, "can wait a few days," Jake interrupted firmly. "At least give the lady time to mourn and think." Grace looked between the two men. "You would do that. Take me to his property," Jake nodded. "I promised Tom I'd look after things until you arrived." Seems only right to follow through, even if circumstances have changed. An hour later, Grace found herself in Jake's wagon, heading out of town toward what should have been her new home with her new husband. The reality of her situation was still sinking in, leaving her numb and disoriented. "Did you know him well?" she finally asked, breaking the silence between them. Jake kept his eyes on the dusty trail ahead. "Well enough. We worked together breaking horses for the Carter Ranch last year. He was a good man, honest, worked hard for that piece of land. How did he die?" Jake's hands tightened on the reins. Fever came on sudden. By the time Doc Richards got out there, it was too late. Tom was asking for you at the end. Grace turned away, looking out at the vast landscape. The setting sun painted the desert in hues of gold and crimson, a beauty she might have appreciated under different circumstances. "I never even saw his face," she whispered. Jake's voice was low when he replied. "He kept a tintype of you. Said you were the prettiest girl he'd ever laid eyes on, even just in a picture." The small homestead came into view as they crested a hill, a simple cabin with a barn beside it, nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. It was modest but neat, with a small garden plot beside it. Thomas had written about planting vegetables for them to tend together. Jake pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. "I'll get your bags." Grace climbed down, her legs stiff from travel. The cabin door was unlocked. There was little need for locks this far from town. Inside was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner with a patchwork quilt. A door led to what must be a second small room. "He built most of it himself," Jake said from the doorway, setting her valise inside. "Was adding that second room for? Well, for when you had a family." Grace ran her fingers along the smooth wooden table. "Where is he buried?" Jake gestured toward the ridge visible through the small window. "Up there, where he wanted to be. Said he could see all his dreams from that spot." "Will you take me there? Now, I'd like to. Say goodbye, at least." Jake nodded. "Of course." The climb was steep but not long. As they reached the top of the ridge, Grace saw the fresh mound of earth with a simple wooden cross bearing Thomas Blackburn's name. The view was breathtaking, the cabin below, the expanse of land stretching out, and the mountains in the distance turning purple in the fading light. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "He chose it for you. Said he wanted to build something worth offering to a fine Boston lady." Grace knelt beside the grave, her fingers touching the loose soil. "I never knew you," she whispered, "but I'm grateful for your kindness, for offering me a new life." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm sorry I arrived too late." Jake stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. When Grace finally rose, he cleared his throat. "There's food in the cabin, not much, but enough for tonight. I'll bring more supplies tomorrow. You've already done so much, I can't impose further." "It's no imposition. I promised Tom I'd look after things until you arrived." "Just because he's gone doesn't mean my word is any less binding." In the gathering dusk, they walked back to the cabin. Jake lit the lamps and built a small fire to ward off the desert night's chill. He showed Grace where everything was kept and promised to return the next morning. "Thank you, Mr. Foster," Grace said at the door. "I don't know what I would have done without your help today." Jake placed his hat back on his head. "Jake, please, and you don't need to thank me. Get some rest, Miss Daniels. Tomorrow's another day." Alone in the cabin that should have been her marital home, Grace finally allowed herself to fully feel the devastation of her circumstances. She wept for the future she had imagined, for the kind man she would never know, and for her own uncertain fate. Jake returned the next morning as promised, his wagon loaded with supplies from town. "I spoke with the bank manager," he said as he carried a sack of flour into the cabin. "Convinced him to give you at least a month before making any decisions about the property." Grace, who had been up since dawn exploring the small homestead, looked at him in surprise. "How did you manage that?" A slight smile crossed Jake's face. Reminded him that Tom Blackburn paid his debts and that his intended bride deserved the courtesy of time to settle his affairs. Also might have mentioned that Sheriff Miller would take a dim view of rushing a grieving woman. "I'm not sure I deserve to be called his widow when we never even wed," Grace said, accepting the supplies. "In the eyes of most folks around here, the fact that you traveled all this way on his promise is commitment enough." Jake paused, seeming to consider something. "Miss Daniels, I know this is forward, but I have a proposition that might help us both." Grace stiffened slightly. "What kind of proposition?" "Nothing improper," Jake assured her quickly. "I've got skills with horses and I've been saving to buy my own spread someday, but land is dear and I'm still working for others. This place needs work, the garden needs tending, the barn needs repair, and there's good grazing land that could support a small herd." "What are you suggesting?" "A business arrangement. I could work this land, help make it profitable. We could split whatever we earn. It would give you time to decide your next steps without worrying about immediate survival." Grace studied him carefully. "Why would you do this?" Jake looked out the window toward Thomas's grave on the ridge. "Tom was a friend. He'd want his land worked and he'd want you taken care of. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've been wanting to try my hand at running my own place for some time. This benefits us both." After careful consideration, Grace agreed to Jake's proposal. He would continue working at the Carter Ranch 3 days a week, but would spend the remainder of his time improving Thomas's homestead. He would sleep in the barn to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The arrangement quickly settled into a routine. Jake worked tirelessly, repairing fences, preparing fields, and teaching Grace about the demands of ranch life. She, in turn, maintained the cabin, planted the garden Thomas had started, and began taking in mending work from town to supplement their income. As June turned to July and the summer heat intensified, Grace found herself watching Jake as he worked. There was a quiet competence to him, a steadfastness she had never encountered in the men she had known in Boston. He rarely spoke of his past, though she had gleaned that he had been orphaned young and had made his way west as a teenager, learning the cowboy trade through hard experience. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset, Grace finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why aren't you married, Jake? A man like you could surely have his pick of women in these parts." Jake was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Never found a reason to settle before. Most women I've known weren't keen on the hardships of this life, and I never had much to offer until I could get my own place." He glanced at her. "What about you? Why a mail-order bride arrangement?" "Surely a beautiful woman like you had suitors in Boston." Grace smiled ruefully. "Beauty doesn't count for much when you're poor. I worked in a textile factory since I was 14, then as a seamstress. The men I knew either saw me as beneath them or were hardly better off than I was. Thomas's letters offered something different: respect, partnership, a chance to build something meaningful." "He would have treated you well," Jake said softly. "I believe he would have." Grace looked up at the ridge where Thomas lay. "It's strange to mourn someone you never met, isn't it?" "You're mourning the future you lost as much as the man," Jake observed. "There's no shame in that." As July progressed, Jake brought 2 horses to the property, a gentle mare for Grace to learn riding and a sturdy gelding for work. He taught her patiently, his hands steady as he helped her mount, his instructions clear as he showed her how to guide the animal. "You're a natural," he told her after she had successfully ridden the perimeter of their property without assistance. "I had a good teacher," she replied, flushed with accomplishment and aware of his approving gaze. In town, Grace gradually became known and accepted. She attended church services, made friends with several of the local women, and established herself as a skilled seamstress. If there were whispers about her unusual living arrangement with Jake Foster, They were generally sympathetic rather than scandalized. Sheriff Miller visited occasionally, checking on her welfare. "Foster's doing right by you and by Tom's memory," he commented during one such visit. "That land's looking better than it ever has." By August, they had added 6 more horses to the property, young ones that Jake was training to sell. Grace had learned to help with the training, her initially timid approach giving way to confident handling under Jake's guidance. One evening, returning from a successful day selling 2 of their trained horses in town, Jake found Grace sitting on the ridge beside Thomas's grave. He hesitated, then climbed up to join her, keeping a respectful distance. 3 months today," Grace said without turning. 3 months since I arrived to find him already gone." Jake nodded, looking out over the land that was now showing signs of their joint labor repaired fences, a thriving garden, healthy horses in the corral. "You've done him proud, bringing his land to life." "We have," Grace corrected, finally looking at him. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Jake." There was something in her gaze that made his heart beat faster, something that had been growing between them during their shared meals, their work side by side, their conversations under the stars. "Grace," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. "It's all right," she said softly. "I've been thinking about it too." "About what?" he asked, though he knew. "About how you've become much more than a business partner to me, about how I look forward to seeing you each morning, about how I've come to care for you in a way I never expected." Jake moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I told myself it was wrong that you came here to be Tom's wife, that I was betraying his memory by feeling this way." "Do you think he would begrudge us happiness?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man who by all accounts was kind and generous." "No," Jake admitted. "But I wanted to be sure it wasn't just circumstance throwing us together." Grace reached out, her hand finding his. "It's more than that, you must know it is." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, there beside Thomas's grave with the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant colors. When they parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I've been saving every penny from our horse sales," he confessed. "Not just for the ranch, I've been hoping. Dreaming that someday you might consider me worthy of offering you what Tom meant to." Grace touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You already are worthy, Jake Foster. You've proven that 100 times over." That night, Jake didn't sleep in the barn as usual. Instead, they talked for hours in front of the cabin's fireplace, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their future. When Grace finally retired to her room, it was with the understanding that things between them had irrevocably changed. The following Sunday, they rode into town together for church services. Afterward, Jake spoke privately with Reverend Adams while Grace chatted with Widow Jenkins and some of the other town women. "What were you discussing with the Reverend?" Grace asked as they rode home. Jake's expression was a mixture of nervousness and determination. "I was asking how soon he might be available to perform a wedding ceremony should a certain lady agree to have me." Grace pulled her horse to a stop, staring at him. "Jake Foster, is that a proposal?" He reined in beside her, reaching across to take her hand. "Not exactly how I planned it, but yes, I love you, Grace Daniels. I know it hasn't been that long, but I know my own heart. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "I came west to marry a man I had never met, based on letters and hope. Now I find myself loving a man I've come to know better than anyone in my life. Yes, Jake. Yes, I will marry you." They were wed 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the small church in Copper Creek. Sheriff Miller gave the bride away, and much of the town turned out to witness the union. Afterward, there was a celebration at the saloon, cleared of its usual business for the day and decorated with wildflowers gathered by the schoolchildren. "Mrs. Foster," Jake whispered in her ear as they danced to the fiddle music. "Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" "It does indeed, Mr. Foster," Grace replied, her heart full as she looked up at the man who had so unexpectedly become her husband. That night, as they returned to what was now truly their home, Jake carried her over the threshold as tradition demanded. Inside, he had prepared a surprise new curtains for the windows, a vase of wildflowers on the table, and a small wooden box that he presented to her with solemn ceremony. Inside was a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged. Grace did, finding a small tintype photograph inside the same one she had sent to Thomas months ago. "Tom kept it close to his heart," Jake explained. "After he passed, I kept it safe, knowing you should have it someday. I thought perhaps you might want to put a different picture in it now, but I wanted you to have this piece of the past." Grace closed the locket gently. "No, I'll keep it as it is. It's part of what brought me here, part of what led me to you. Our story began with loss, but it doesn't diminish what we've found." As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, the Foster Ranch thrived. Jake's reputation as a horse trainer grew, bringing customers from as far as Tucson. Grace's seamstress business expanded, and she began teaching several local girls the finer points of dressmaking. They built the second bedroom that Thomas had started, though now it would serve a different purpose than originally intended. By Christmas, when Grace shared the news that they would be welcoming a child in the summer, Jake's joy was boundless. "I never thought I could be this happy," he told her, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. "You've given me everything I never dared hope for." "We've built it together," Grace corrected him. "Just as we'll build our future one day at a time." In May of 1879, exactly 1 year after Grace had first arrived in Copper Creek, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas Jacob Foster, honoring both the man whose dreams had brought Grace west and the father who would raise him with love and dedication. On a warm evening soon after, Jake carried his infant son up to the ridge while Grace followed. Together, they stood beside the grave of Thomas Blackburn. "We wanted you to meet our son," Grace said softly. "He carries your name, and he'll grow up knowing the part you played in bringing his parents together." Jake, with his free arm around Grace's waist, added, "We're tending your land well, Tom. It's becoming everything you dreamed it would be." As they stood there, the setting sun gilded the landscape, illuminating the thriving ranch below the expanded garden, the new corral, the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. It was a scene of prosperity and promise, built from what had begun as heartbreak. "Sometimes," Grace mused as they walked back down the ridge, their son cradled in Jake's strong arms, "life's greatest blessings come from our deepest disappointments." "And sometimes," Jake replied, pressing a kiss to her temple, "a man digging a grave finds himself uncovering his heart instead." 5 years later, the Foster Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Jake's expertise with horses had earned them a contract supplying mounts for the cavalry at Fort Bowie, and Grace's dressmaking had expanded into a small shop in town that employed 3 other women. Their family had grown as well. Thomas Jacob, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit, had been joined by a 3-year-old sister, Emma. Grace was expecting their 3rd child, due to arrive just after Christmas. On the anniversary of their wedding each year, they made a pilgrimage to Thomas Blackburn's grave, bringing wildflowers and spending a moment in quiet reflection. They had added a proper headstone, carved with his name and the words "His dream lives on." "Do you ever wonder what might have been?" Jake asked once as they walked hand in hand back to their home, watching their children run ahead. Grace squeezed his fingers. "Sometimes. But then I look at our life together, at our children, at all we've built, and I know we're exactly where we're meant to be. Thomas brought me west, but you, Jake Foster, you gave me a home. And you gave me your heart," he replied, drawing her close for a kiss that, even after years together, still made her pulse quicken. "The best trade I ever made," she whispered against his lips, secure in the knowledge that sometimes life's most unexpected turns lead to its greatest joys.